his coming will produce. There will be but one subject throughout the parishes of Donwell and Highbury, but one interest, one object of curiosity. It will be all Mr. Frank Churchill. We shall thank him and speak of nobody else. You will excuse my being so much overpowered. If I find him conversable, I shall be glad of his acquaintance. But if he is only a chattering coxcomb, he will not occupy much of my time or thoughts. My idea of him is that he can adapt his conversation to the taste of everybody, and has the power as well as the wish of being universally agreeable. To you, he will talk of farming, to me of drawing or music, and so on to everybody. Having that general information on all subjects, which will enable him to follow the lead, or take the lead, just as propriety may require, and to speak extremely well on each. That is my idea of him. And mine, said Mr. Knightley warmly, is that if he turn out anything like it, he will be the most insufferable fellow breathing. What, at 23, to be the king of his company, the great man, the practised politician, who is to read everybody's character and make everybody's talents conduce to the display of his own superiority, to be dispensing his flatteries around, that he may make all appear like fools compared with himself. My dear Emma, your own good sense could not endure such a puppy when it came to the point. I will say no more about him, cried Emma. You turn everything to evil. We are both prejudiced, you against, I for him, and we have no chance of agreeing till he is really here. Prejudiced? I am not prejudiced, but I am very much, and without being at all ashamed of it. My love for Mr. and Mrs. Weston gives me a decided prejudice in his favour. He is a person I never think of from one's month-end to another, said Mr. Knightley, with a degree of vexation which made Emma immediately talk of something, though she could not comprehend why he should be angry. To take a dislike to a young man, only because he appeared to be of a different disposition from himself, was unworthy the real liberality of mind which she was always used to acknowledge in him. For with all the high opinion of himself which he had often laid to his charge, she had never before for a moment supposed it could make him unjust to merit of another. Emma and Harriet had been walking together one morning, and, in Emma's opinion, had been talking enough of Mr. Elton for that day. She could not think that Harriet's solace or her own sins required more, and she was therefore industriously getting rid of the subject as they returned. But it burst out again when she thought she had succeeded, and after speaking some time of what the poor must suffer in winter, and receiving no other answer than a very plaintive, Mr. Elton is good to the poor, she found something else must be done. They were just approaching the house where lived Mrs. and Mr. Bate. She decided to call upon them and seek safety in numbers. There was always sufficient reason for such an attention. Mr. and Miss Bates loved to be called on, and she knew she was considered by the very few who presumed ever to see imperfection in her as rather negligent in that respect, and as not contributing what she ought to the stock of their scanty comforts. She had had many a hint from Mr. Knightley, and some from her own heart, as to her deficiency, but none were equal to counteract the persuasion of its being very disagreeable, a waste of time, tiresome women, and all of the horror of being in danger of falling in with the second rate and the third rate of Highbury. so kind as to say she liked it very much, and therefore she hoped Miss Woodhouse and Miss Smith would do them the favour to eat a piece too. The mention of the Coles was sure to be followed by that of Mr. Elton. There was intimacy between them, and Mr. Cole had heard from Mr. Elton since going his way. Emma knew that what was coming. They must have had the letter over again, and settle how long he had been gone, and how much he was engaged in company, and what a favourite he was whenever he went, and how full the master of the ceremonies balls had been, and she went through it very well, with all the interest and all the accommodation that could be requisite, and always putting forward to prevent Harriet's being obliged to say a word. This she had been prepared for when she entered the house, but meant, having once talked him handsomely over, to be no farther accommodated by any troublesome topic, and to wander at large amongst all the mistresses and misses of Highbury, and their card parties. She had not been prepared to have Jane Fairfax succeed Mr. Elton, but he was actually hurried off by Miss Bates. She jumped away from him, and at last abruptly to the Coles, to usher in a letter from her niece. "Oh, yes, Mr. Elton, I understood. Certainly as to dancing, Mrs. Cole was telling me the dancing at the rooms at Bath was... Mrs. Cole was so kind as to sit some time with us, talking of Jane, for as soon as she came in, she began inquiring after her. Jane is so very great a favourite there. Wherever she is with us, Mrs. Cole does not know how she shew her kindness enough, and I must say that Jane deserves it as much as anybody can." And so she began inquiring after her directly, saying, "I know you cannot have heard from Jane lately, because it is not her time for writing." And when I immediately said, "But indeed we have. We had a letter this very morning," I do not know that I ever saw anybody more surprised. "Have you upon your honour?" said she. "Well, that is quite unexpected. Do let me hear what she says." Emma's politeness was at hand directly to say with smiling interest, "Have you heard from Miss Fairfax so lately? I am extremely happy. I hope she is well." "Thank you. You are so kind," replied the happily deceived aunt, while eagerly hunting for the letter. "Oh, here it is. I was sure it could not be far off, but I had put my housewife upon it, you see, without being aware, so I was quite hid. But I had it in my hand so very lately that I was almost sure it must be on the table. I was reading it to Mrs. Cole, and since she went away, I was reading it again to my mother, for it is such a pleasure to her, a letter from Jane, that she can never hear it often enough. So I knew it could not be far off, and here it is, only just under my housewife. And Sissy was so kind as to wish to hear what she says. But first of all, I really must, in justice to Jane, apologise for her writing so short a letter. Only 2 pages, you see, hardly 2, and in general she fills the whole paper and crosses half. My mother often wonders that I can make it out so well. She often says when the letter is first opened, 'Well, Hetty, now I think you will be put to it to make out all the checker work, don't you, ma'am?' And I tell her I am sure she would contrive to make it out herself if she had nobody to do it for her. Every word of it, I am sure she would pore over till she had made out every word. And indeed, though my mother's eyes are not so good as they were, she can see amazingly well still, thank God, with the help of spectacles. It is such a blessing. My mother's are really good indeed. Jane often says when she is here, 'I am sure, grandmamma, you must have had very strong eyes to see as you do, and so much of fine work as you have done too. I only wish my eyes may last as well.' All this spoken extremely fast obliged Miss Bates to stop for breath, and Emma said something very civil excellence of Miss Fairfax's handwriting. "You're extremely kind," replied Miss Bates, highly gratified. "You, who are such a judge and write so beautifully yourself. I am sure there is nobody's praises that could give us much more pleasure as Miss Woodhouse's. My mother does not hear. She's a little deaf, you know. Ma'am," addressing her, "do you hear what Miss Woodhouse is so obliging to say about Jane's handwriting?" And Emma had the advantage of hearing her own silly compliment repeated twice over before the good old lady could comprehend it. She was pondering, in the meanwhile, upon the possibility, without seeming rude, or making her escape from Jane Fairfax's letter, and had almost resolved on hurrying away directly under some slight excuse, when Miss Bates turned to her again and seized her attention. "My mother's deafness is very trifling, you see, just nothing at all. By only raising my voice and saying anything 2 or 3 times over, she is sure to hear. But then she is used to my voice. But it is very remarkable that she should always hear Jane better than she does me. Jane speaks so distinct. However, she will not find her grandmamma at all deafer than she was 2 years ago, which is saying a great deal of my mother's time of life. And it really is full 2 years, you know, since she was here. We never were so long without seeing her before. And as I was telling Mrs. Cole, we shall hardly know how to make enough of her now." "Are you expecting Miss Fairfax's here soon?" "Oh yes, next week." "Indeed. That must be very great pleasure. Thank you. You are very kind. Yes, next week. Everybody's so surprised, and everybody says the same obliging things. I am sure she will be as happy to see her friends at Highbury as they can be to see her. Yes, Friday or Saturday. She cannot say which, because Colonel Campbell will be wanting the carriage himself one of those days, so very good of them to send her the whole way. But they do always do, you know. Oh yes, Friday or Saturday next. That is what she writes about. That is the reason of her writing out of rule, as we call it. For, in the common cause, we should not have heard from her before next Tuesday or Wednesday. Yes, so I imagined. I was afraid there could be a little chance of my hearing anything of Miss Fairfax's today. So obliging of you. No, we should not have heard, if it had not been for this particular circumstance of her being to come here so soon. My mother's so delighted, for she is to be 3 months with hers, at least. 3 months, she says so, positively, as I am going to have the pleasure of reading to you. The case is, you see, that Miss Campbells are going to Ireland. Mrs. Dixon has persuaded her father and mother to come over and see her directly. They had not intended to go over till the summer, but she is so impatient to see them again, for till she's married last October, she was never away from them so much as a week, which must make it very strange to be in different kingdoms, I was going to say, but however different countries. And so she wrote a very urgent letter to her mother, or her father. I declare I do not know which it was, but we shall see presently in Jane's letter. Wrote in Mr. Dixon's name, as well as her own, to press their coming over directly, and they would give them the meeting in Dublin, and take them back to their country seat, Bale Craig, a beautiful place, I fancy. Jane has heard a great deal of its beauty, from Mr. Dixon, I mean. I do not know that she ever heard about it from anybody else, but it was very natural, you know, that she should like to speak of his own place while he was paying his addresses. And as Jane used to be very often walking out with them, for Colonel and Miss Campbell were very particular about their daughters not walking out often, only with Mr. Dixon, for which I do not blame them. Of course, she had everything he might be telling Miss Campbell about his own home in Ireland, and I think she wrote us word that he had shown them some drawings of the place, views that he had taken most amiable, charming young man, I believe. Jane was quite longing to go to Ireland from his accounts of things. At this moment, an ingenious and animating suspicion entering Emma's brain with regard to Jane Fairfax, this charming Dr. Dixon, and the not going to Ireland. She said, with insidious designs of further discovery, "You must feel it very fortunate that Miss Fairfax should be allowed to come to you at such a time, considering the very particular friendship between her and Mrs. Dixon. You could hardly have expected her to be excused from accompanying Colonel and Mrs. Campbell." Very true indeed. The very thing that we have always been rather afraid of, for we should have not liked to have her at such a distance from us for months together, not able to come if anything was to happen. But you see, everything turns out for the best. They want her excessively to come over with Colonel and Mrs. Campbell, quite dependent upon it. Nothing can be more kind or pressing than their joint invitation, Jane says. As you will hear presently, Mr. Dixon does not seem in the least backward in any attention. He is a most charming young man, ever since the service he rendered Jane at Weymouth, when they were out in that party on the water, and she, by the sudden whirling round of something, or among the sails, would have been dashed into sea at once, and actually was all but gone, if he had not, with the greatest presence of mind, caught hold of her habit. I can never think of it without trembling. But ever since we had a history of that day, I had been so fond of Mr. Dixon. But in spite of all her friends' urgency and her own wish of seeing Ireland, Miss Fairfax prefers devoting the time to you and Mrs. Bates. Yes, entirely her own doing, entirely her own choice, and Colonel and Mrs. Campbell think she does quite right, just what they should recommend, and indeed they particularly wish her and try her native air, as she has not been quite so well as usual lately. I am concerned to hear of it. I think they judge wisely, but Mrs. Dixon must be very much disappointed. Mrs. Dixon, I understand, has no remarkable degree of personal beauty, is not by any means to be compared with Miss Fairfax. Oh, no, you are very obliging to say such things, but certainly not. There is no comparison between them. Miss Campbell always was absolutely plain, but extremely elegant and amiable. Yes, that of course. Jane caught a bad cold, poor thing, so long ago as the 7th of November, as I'm going to read to you, and has never been well since. A long time, is it not, for a cold to hang upon her? She never mentioned it before, because she would not alarm us. Just like her, so considerate. But however, she is so far from well that her kind friends, the Campbells, think she had better come home and try an air that always agrees with her, and they have no doubt that 3 or 4 months at Highbury will entirely cure her, and it is certainly a great deal better that she should come here than go to Ireland. If she is unwell, nobody could nurse her as we should. It appears to me the most desirable arrangement in the world, and so she is to come to us next Friday or Saturday, and the Campbells leave town in their way to Holyhead the Monday following, as you will find from Jane's letter. So sudden. You may guess, dear Miss Woodhouse, what a flurry it has thrown me in, if it was not for the drawback of her illness. But I am afraid we must expect to see her grown thin and looking very poorly. I must tell you what an unlucky thing happened to me as to that. I always make a point of reading Jane's letter through to myself first, before I read them aloud to my mother, you know, for fear of there being anything in there that might distress her. Jane desired me to do it, so I always do, and so I began today with my usual caution, but no sooner did I come to the mention of her being unwell, that I burst out, quite frightened, with Bless me, poor Jane is ill, which my mother, being on the watch, heard distinctively and was sadly alarmed at. However, when I read on, I found it was not near so bad as I had fancied at first, and I make so light of it now to her that she does not think much about it. But I cannot imagine how I could be so off guard. If Jane does not get well soon, you will call in Mr. Perry. The expense shall not be thought of, and though he is so liberal and so fond of Jane, that I dare say he would not mean to charge anything for attendance, we could not suffer it to be so. You know, he has a wife and a family to maintain, and is not to be giving away his time. Well, now, I have just given you a hint of what Jane writes about. We will turn to her letter, and I am sure she tells you her own story a great deal better than I can tell it for her. I am afraid we must be running away, said Emma, glancing at Harriet, and beginning to rise. My father will be expecting us. I had no intention. I thought I had no power of staying home more than 5 minutes when I first entered the house. I merely called because I would not pass the door without inquiring after Mrs. Bates. But I have been so